In this video, I'm going to be talking about posture, positioning, and pressure. I call these the 3 Ps of solving the pelvic floor puzzle. Now, posture, we all know what posture is. We think we know what good posture is. And then positioning, even though it might sound like the same thing, we'll look at how we position our bodies in some common ways throughout the day. And then we're going to talk about the internal pressure system and how it works optimally with good positioning and posture. So I'm going to show you in my body, since I don't have a helper here with me, what my default posture is. So my body loves to go into an anterior tilt. I also call it duck butt. When I'm in an anterior pelvic tilt, it causes my rib cage to flare forward. Now, our diaphragm, our respiratory diaphragm, sits at the base of our ribs. And when we breathe, a true full diaphragmatic breath is a breath that expands 360 degrees. The entire rib cage expands out on the inhale and contracts in on the exhale. So we like our rib cage right over the pelvis. We also need to have the head over the rib cage. So this aligns us ideally. This is really good posture. So as far as positioning goes, something that happens in my body when I go into my anterior tilt, my knees turn toward one another and I collapse into the inner arches of my feet. This is very common. I see this all the time. So what happens when those two things occur? Well, when we collapse into the inner arches, it drops the whole midline of the body. The pelvic floor is involved in that. And so that affects the positioning of our hips and how the muscles work. As far as the knees go, if they're turned into each other, it puts a lot of additional wear and tear into the inner sides of the knee joints. And I'm finding this out the older I get. So what I do to correct my whole body from the bottom up is I turn my shins to face forward. It's like externally rotating my lower legs. It lifts my arches. It feels like it energizes me from the ground up, and it even affects my upper posture. So let's see if you can see this on the camera. So I'm in my anterior tilt. My knees are turned in. I'm collapsed into my inner arches. If I externally rotate my lower legs, it lifted me. It improved my posture. It's got my arches lifted. So how we position ourselves makes a really big difference. Now, another very common position of the pelvis that we see all the time, especially in our more sedentary technical world where we're seated all the time, is the posterior tilt. Lots and lots of people tuck their tailbone under and push their hips forward. And as you can see, it translates up into my upper back as a little bit of kyphosis and maybe even some forward head. So when we're in this position, the rib cage now flares to the back, which angles the diaphragm more to the back of the body. So in this one, it's not my go-to posture, but we can stand tall in this one too. We want to think about the pelvis being neutral and our heart lifted, head over rib cage over pelvis. Very, very important for how our internal pressure system works. I'm going to show you one more postural deviation that's really, really popular. is this. How often do you shift into one hip when you're standing? Most of us do it all the time. And most of us have a favorite hip. So what does this do? This over lengthens the muscles on the side of the hip that we're standing in, shortens and tightens the muscles on the other side, and it affects the pelvic floor. How we position our pelvis regularly will determine if it's tighter on one side than the other, or shorter in the front or in the back. So what I like to do and what I teach my clients is when you're standing in public, this is a great time to practice. Maybe you're in line somewhere, maybe you're even doing the dishes at home. Have your feet just a little bit wider than your hips. This makes it very difficult to comfortably shift into a hip. And if you find that you're shifting, catch yourself and correct it. Stand up straight through your entire body. Now, if you are an inner arch collapser, something you can also do at home is lift your toes. When you lift your toes, it automatically lifts the arches of the feet. I'm going to talk about feet and how they affect the pelvic floor more in another video. But for now, we know that we don't want to collapse to the inner arches. We might need to make that little lower leg external rotation to lift and energize us from the feet up through the crown. We want to line the head up over the rib cage, which shines down over the pelvis. So getting back to pressure, our core is not just our abdominals. Our core is made up of the respiratory diaphragm at the top, the pelvic diaphragm at the bottom, or the pelvic floor, some muscles that run up the spine, and the transverse abdominis muscle that wraps around the body like a corset. It's called a corset muscle sometimes because if you can feel it and you can engage it, it's like someone tightens a corset around you and you can feel that engagement and that stability. So these are the muscles that make up our core. And within the core is our intra-abdominal pressure. It's our pressure system. And when we inhale, the diaphragm expands down, pushes into the organs, they narrow through the pelvis, it presses down into the pelvic floor. And when we exhale, everything lifts and contracts. So this is how it's supposed to work. So if you can imagine that if we're in a poor posture and our rib cage is flaring forward, and when the diaphragm moves, it's not moving down directly into the abdominal cavity, that's going to affect the pressure. Same thing if we're in a posterior tilt and the rib cage opens to the back. We want that ideal posture with the diaphragm sitting almost like an umbrella would sit over your pelvis to get that nice pressure. So, how does pressure affect the pelvic floor? It's a huge player in our pelvic floor issues. So if we're in posterior tilt, my go-to, and my rib cage is flaring forward, and the diaphragm's trying to do its thing, this is going to cause me to most likely have a more upper chest breath. Upper chest breath is linked to the fight or flight response, keeping us in that agitated survival response of the nervous system. So it's not a place we want to breathe all the time. And especially if we experience anxiety, we don't want to always breathe up here. So if we're in a posterior tilt and the diaphragm's tilted back and it's not working efficiently, what this tends to do is breathe into the belly constantly. We don't want to breathe into the belly constantly. If we're practicing our pranayama and we're trying to soothe the nervous system and we're working with our anxiety or even trying to get to know our pelvic floor, diaphragmatic breathing is beautiful, but we don't want to do it all the time. When we have pressure down into the low belly all the time, it pushes into the pelvic floor. And that constant pressure over time can make those muscles lax. And when we need a quick response of the pelvic floor, if we cough or we sneeze or we laugh, they're not able to do it because the pressure's down there. It's in the way, the muscles are lax. So we leak. So much of incontinence and leaking issues come from imbalanced pressure within the core. So head over ribs. We want to think about that 360-degree expansion of the diaphragm that's right over top the pelvic bowl. Posture, positioning, and pressure. In another video, I will be showing ways to make sure that you have that optimal position on your back for when you do some of your exercises lying down on your back, lying down supine. So check those out. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next video.